You didn't actually invite him, did you? Someone whispered as Maria stepped away from the altar, rushing toward the frail man who had just entered the chapel. Whispers rose. Some guests looked away. After all, it was just old Peter, the silent, shabby man who'd lingered outside the diner for years. But then came the sound of boots. 15 army, in full dress uniform, marched through the doors and lined up in perfect formation. The room froze as they raised their hands and saluted, not just Maria, but the man no one thought mattered. If you believe kindness should never be judged, type, I'm outraged. Because what started as a simple act of feeding a stranger became a moment that silenced a town and honored a forgotten hero. Everyone called him Old Peter, a quiet, shabby man who roamed the streets, always polite, never begging. Every afternoon, Maria, a kind-hearted waitress, would slip him a warm plate of food from the back door of her diner. She never asked for anything in return, just smiled and told him, "Eat well, old friend." The locals hardly paid attention to him. To most, he was just another drifter, his coat frayed at the edges, his boots worn to the soles. He moved like a shadow through town, unbothered, unnoticed. But Maria saw something different in him. It had started one stormy evening in early spring. Rain poured relentlessly, soaking the sidewalks, blurring the glow of traffic lights. Maria was wiping down the counter when a flash of movement outside the window caught her eye. There he was, huddled on the edge of the diner's porch, his thin shoulders trembling from the cold. He wasn't holding out his hand. He wasn't even looking toward the door. He just sat there, still as stone, his back resting against the wall like he was trying not to exist. Her coworker scoffed. "Don't waste your time. He's always hanging around. Doesn't say a word." Maria said nothing, but inside, something stirred. Maybe it was the way he held himself, dignified, proud, even in his silence. Maybe it was the way he never looked pitiful, only tired. That evening, she quietly packed a plate with leftover stew, wrapped a biscuit in a napkin, and slipped out the back. When she placed the food beside him, he didn't flinch. He simply turned his face toward her and gave a slow, grateful nod. His eyes, pale and watery, locked with hers for a brief moment. No words, just a silent exchange that said more than thank you ever could. From that night on, it became part of her routine. Every day, before closing, Maria prepared something extra. Sometimes it was soup, other times pasta or a sandwich, depending on what was left. She never asked his name, and he never gave it. But she came to know his rhythms. He arrived around dusk, always settling in the same corner of the porch, always with that same quiet presence. Word got around quickly in the diner. "Feeding the ghost again?" one cook joked. Maria ignored the whispers. She wasn't doing it for recognition. To her, compassion didn't need an audience. The truth was, old Peter fascinated her. He never asked for more, never demanded attention. He often had a book tucked under his arm, yellowed pages held together with tape. He read by the dim porch light with a focus that felt out of place for a man with no home. Sometimes he would hum softly to himself, low and melodic, as though remembering a tune from long ago. He had the look of someone who had once belonged somewhere, who had lived through something worth surviving. Maria began to wonder. Who had he been before the streets swallowed him up? Where had he come from? What had taken everything away from him? She never pushed, never pried. She just kept feeding him. And every evening, he'd accept the meal with that same gentle nod, that same flicker of warmth in his eyes that had clearly seen too much, but still softened when she appeared. To everyone else, he was a nobody. But to Maria, he was someone worth feeding, someone worth remembering. Maria didn't know when the act of kindness turned into habit. It simply became part of her rhythm, like checking the coffee machine or flipping the closed sign. Every day, without fail, she wrapped up a plate and brought it out the back. And every day, he was there, old Peter, sitting in the same corner of the diner's porch, waiting but never asking. He greeted her with nothing more than a nod. No stories, no requests, no past offered. Yet in that silence, Maria felt a strange familiarity grow. Some days, she found herself anticipating his quiet presence more than the noise inside. The seasons rolled by. Rain turned to sun, sun to snow. Still he came. A ghost of the town, unchanged by weather, untouched by time. Her co-workers didn't understand. "He's just a bum, Maria. Why waste your food?" She smiled, unfazed. "Because he eats it." But it wasn't just the eating. It was the way he received it. With quiet dignity, like a guest at a forgotten feast. And it was the small details that began to haunt her thoughts. For one, his clothes, though old and weather-worn, were always remarkably clean. Not spotless, but cared for. His boots, cracked and faded, were regularly wiped of mud. His coat, though patched at the sleeves, hung properly on his frame. He moved with a strange sense of order, a quiet structure that didn't fit the mold of the lost and wandering. Then there were the books. Thick, battered volumes that he cradled like sacred texts. Military history, or memoirs, strategy journals, titles that most wouldn't glance at, yet he read them with steady intent. She once caught a glimpse of underlined passages, crisp pencil marks running down the margins. He wasn't just passing time. He was studying, remembering. Most curious of all, though, was the morning ritual. Maria had passed by the town square one early shift and noticed him there, just after sunrise, standing stiffly near the flagpole outside the post office. Alone, hands behind his back, spine straight, watching the stars and stripes rise in the morning breeze. No one else noticed. No one else looked. But he did every morning, without fail. There was reverence in his stillness, like a man saluting something only he understood. He never spoke of his past, never slipped up, never let a name fall from his lips. Maria once offered him coffee and asked gently, "Were you ever in the service?" He paused. For a breath, a flicker of something crossed his face, regret, or maybe memory. Then came the familiar nod. Nothing more. And so, he remained a mystery. But Maria couldn't help feeling there was a story wrapped inside him, sealed behind silence. A story waiting for the right moment, or maybe the right person, to unlock it. The town didn't change. The diner buzzed with gossip, orders, and laughter. But outside, near the back door, a quiet exchange endured. A plate, a nod, a connection. Maria never expected recognition. She didn't feed old Peter because she thought it would lead anywhere. She fed him because something deep within her said it mattered. Because sometimes you don't need to know a person's past to know their worth. Because sometimes the ones the world forgets are the ones holding on to the pieces that could change everything. And still, every evening, as the last light faded behind the diner, she found him waiting, not with hunger, but with hope. The proposal came on a quiet Sunday evening, beneath a canopy of fading sunlight and citrus blossoms. Daniel, Maria's steady and soft-spoken boyfriend, knelt behind the diner after her shift, holding a simple ring and a trembling smile. Maria gasped, eyes wide, then nodded before he could even finish the question. The town buzzed within hours. A wedding in the making. Maria, the heart of the diner, was finally getting her fairy tale. Well-wishers poured in. Her co-workers hugged her, local shopkeepers dropped off flowers, and even the grumpy postman muttered, "About time." But not everyone celebrated aloud. Old Peter remained at his corner of the porch, where the shadows swallowed his figure just past dusk. That evening, Maria brought him his usual plate, a slice of roast with mashed potatoes, and paused, unsure how to bring it up. Before she could speak, he looked up and said with quiet calm, "You deserve happiness, miss." He smiled. Just once. A small, fleeting curve of the lips that faded almost as quickly as it came. Then he went back to eating. Maria blinked, struck by the way his eyes lingered on her ring, not with envy or sadness, but something else. Something unreadable. Preparations soon overtook her days. Invitations were hand-delivered around town, ribbons and flower samples cluttered her tiny apartment. She picked a modest chapel just outside the square, where the light poured through stained-glass windows, and where she used to sit as a child, dreaming. And still, in the midst of all the excitement, she didn't forget. One afternoon, she left a folded note beside old Peter's bench. A simple message written in the same thoughtful tone she always offered him. "You're invited. I hope you'll come." She wasn't sure he would. He wasn't like other people. He didn't mingle, didn't attend church, never asked for company. But she felt he should know. She wanted him there, not out of charity or obligation, but because somehow he had become a quiet fixture in the rhythm of her life. That night, for the first time in years, old Peter didn't go straight to his corner. Instead, he walked slowly, methodically, through the side streets of town, until he reached the edge of the woods. Hidden beneath an old metal box buried near the roots of a crumbling oak, he retrieved something no one in town could ever have imagined. A military-issued satellite phone, coated in dust and sealed in a leather pouch. His hands, though weathered, moved with precision as he powered it on. The screen lit up with a soft green glow. He squinted, then dialed. Long pauses, short replies, coordinates, names, clearances. His voice, rarely used, now carried weight, clipped in tone, authoritative. The kind of voice that once gave commands across continents. When he hung up, he didn't sit back down. He didn't return to the diner porch. He stood there, silent in the trees, as something long dormant stirred beneath the shell of the man they called Old Peter. It was subtle, but undeniable. The slight lift in his shoulders. The way he glanced at the horizon as if seeing it through a different lens. A man who had waited in silence for years was suddenly alert, ready. Maria, in her whirlwind of flowers and seating charts, had no idea. But something was beginning, and it had started with a proposal. The morning sun spilled golden light across the sleepy village, painting rooftops and cobblestones with quiet warmth. Birds stirred in the trees. Church bells rang softly, their chime laced with excitement. Inside the old chapel, the wooden pews creaked under the weight of neighbors and friends, all dressed in their best. The air buzzed with joy and curiosity. Maria's wedding had become the town's event of the year. Candles flickered in delicate holders. Petals lined the aisle. And at the front stood Daniel, nervous and smiling, adjusting his tie for the third time. Then the music began, soft, reverent, slow. The back doors opened, and Maria stepped through, radiant in ivory lace. Her veil shimmered like morning dew, and her eyes searched the crowd with quiet hope. She walked down the aisle with the kind of smile that made people cry without knowing why. Whispers floated up like smoke. She's glowing. She deserves this. But then, something changed. A low, unfamiliar sound rumbled through the silence. Faint at first, then louder. A mechanical hum. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't traffic. Engines. People turned. Heads craned toward the windows. Outside, in the gravel path leading to the chapel, a convoy of black military vehicles had come to a slow, deliberate stop. Maria paused mid-step, heart hitching. The music faltered. Then, abruptly, the great wooden doors flung open. 15 men stepped inside in synchronized formation, their boots hitting the floor in perfect rhythm. They wore full military dress uniforms, pressed, gleaming, their medals catching the light with every step. Not a wrinkle, not a stumble. Every movement precise, every expression unreadable. Gasps filled the room. Someone whispered, "Who are they?" Another murmured, "What's happening?" The pastor, hands poised over his open book, froze. Maria turned, wide-eyed. Her bouquet trembled in her hands. The soldiers marched all the way down the aisle without a word, their presence part ghost story, part prophecy. They stopped just before the altar. The leading officer, tall with piercing eyes and silver trim on his shoulders, raised his hand. And they saluted, straight and sharp, in her direction. The entire chapel fell silent. Maria looked at them, stunned. She didn't know them. She'd never seen any of their faces before. And yet, something in their eyes told her this was no mistake. Her lips parted, as if to ask who they were, but no words came. All around her, guests rose from their seats in a slow, uncertain wave. Not out of panic, but respect. Awe. As though they, too, could sense something sacred in the room. Daniel stepped aside, bewildered but watching. The officer lowered his hand, stepped forward, and spoke just loud enough for all to hear. "We're here for the woman who fed our commander when the world had forgotten him." The words struck like a lightning bolt in still air. Murmurs swept the pews. Maria stared at the officer, her mind racing. "Commander?" Before she could make sense of it, he added gently, "We come in honor. For kindness given without condition." The others behind him stood motionless, a wall of loyalty and silence. Maria's breath caught. She glanced at the back of the chapel, half expecting him, Old Peter, to appear in the doorway. But he wasn't there. Not yet. Only the echo of boots and the weight of 15 salutes remained, turning her wedding into something far bigger than she had ever imagined. The lead soldier stepped forward, the solemn weight of his metal shimmering under the chapel's stained glass light. He removed his hat slowly, respectfully, as silence tightened around the room like a held breath. "Ma'am," he began, voice firm but reverent, "we're here to honor the woman who saved our commander." The words hung in the air. Maria blinked, confused. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. The chapel, once filled with excitement, now bristled with tension and bewilderment. All eyes turned to her, some curious, others in disbelief. The soldier continued, "You knew him as Old Peter. But to us, he was Colonel Peter Marshall." A sharp gasp echoed from the back of the room. Another murmur, "Colonel?" Maria's heart skipped. Her fingers clenched tighter around the bouquet. "Colonel? That couldn't be Old Peter." He led Bravo Company, the soldier went on, glancing at the brothers in arms behind him. A brilliant strategist. Decorated. Feared by enemies. Respected by nations. But during a covert operation overseas, an ambush took out his entire unit. Communications were severed. Everyone presumed him dead. But he survived. The room had grown so quiet, Maria could hear the soft creak of the wooden floor beneath the soldier's boots. He walked away from the wreckage. Injured, disoriented, broken in spirit. We searched for months. When the military declared him Kia, his name was etched in stone. But he was never dead. Just gone. A collective shiver passed through the room like wind through a forest. He wandered, the soldier said, from town to town, not for shelter, but for silence. He carried guilt heavier than his own gear. We found out later he refused to touch a phone, refused help. He felt he didn't deserve it. He paused, his expression tightening. Until he met you. Maria's knees weakened. She found herself gripping the side of a pew, stunned. The memories of every quiet exchange, every warm plate passed through the diner's back door, played in her mind like snapshots. You gave him something no one else had, the soldier said. Not out of duty, not because you knew who he was, but because you saw a human being where others saw a ghost. A hush fell. Even the candles seemed to flicker with anticipation. For years, you kept him alive, not just physically, but spiritually. You reminded a soldier that kindness still existed in the world he once fought to protect. Maria felt her eyes burn. Her breath came in shallow pulls, her world turning slowly on its axis. All this time, the quiet, mysterious man she had shared her meals with, the man others dismissed as nothing, had been a giant hidden in plain sight. And yet, she had never asked, never expected anything. Maybe that's why he chose to return. Behind the soldier, the other men stood straighter, a formation of honor and memory. They weren't just here for a wedding. They were here for a reckoning. One of the older guests whispered, all these years, and we never knew. Maria could barely hear Daniel beside her. The room was spinning, not with fear, but revelation. The weight of the moment pressed on her chest, not just because of who old Peter had been, but because of what her quiet gestures had meant. No parades, no speeches, just a plate of food, a smile, a moment. But those small things had been enough to awaken a fallen commander. And now, the world knew. For a heartbeat, time seemed to pause inside the chapel. The guests remained frozen in silence, still absorbing the revelation that the man they had all ignored for years, the quiet, weathered soul they called Old Peter, was none other than Colonel Peter Marshall, a living legend in uniform again. Then, slowly, the sound of polished boots echoed across the floor. The soldiers, 15 of them, sharp in stature, unwavering in poise, stepped aside and formed two lines, one to the left, the other to the right, stretching from the altar to the open chapel doors. Their movements were crisp, rehearsed, almost ceremonial, but it wasn't the kind of formality born of tradition. It was something else. It was honor. It was gratitude. And at the center of it all, the once-forgotten man emerged. Colonel Marshall stood taller now. Gone was the slouch of a weary soul, the shiver of a man lost in time. He wore a freshly pressed military coat, the silver of his medals gleaming beneath the stained glass light. A quiet storm of valor wrapped around his chest. He looked every bit the commander his men had followed into fire, and would follow again. He took a steady step forward and approached Maria, who stood frozen at the altar, her bouquet trembling in her grasp. Their eyes met. He bowed his head, gently, reverently. I couldn't offer you a gift, he said, his voice gravel and grace, but I brought the men whose lives you touched through me. The words caught in her throat. She didn't know whether to cry, to speak, or simply to hold on to this moment before it vanished. Colonel Marshall extended his arm, inviting her forward. She hesitated only a breath before taking his hand. And together, they turned to the aisle. The chapel had fallen so still, Maria could hear the soft rustle of her dress as she walked. The corridor of soldiers stood like sentinels, eyes ahead, spines unbending. As she passed each man, they raised their hands in salute, not to the colonel, not to the pastor, but to her, one by one. A young soldier with a scar beneath his eye, a gray-haired veteran whose hands had seen decades of battles, a broad-shouldered man who blinked rapidly, fighting emotion. All of them, saluting a waitress who had simply chosen to care. Maria's steps were slow, but sure. Her tears welled, not out of sadness, but disbelief, that something so small, so humble, could echo so far. She reached the midpoint of the aisle, and the guests, once silent, began to rise. One woman placed a hand over her heart. Another began to clap, soft, uncertain. Then others joined, the sound spreading like a ripple through still water. Applause, gentle at first, built into a solemn, thunderous ovation. This wasn't a celebration of lace and vows anymore. It had become something sacred. A woman had lifted a man from the shadows with nothing but kindness, and in doing so, had lit the path for others to follow. Maria reached the chapel doors, the sun spilling in behind her, and turned back. Her gaze swept the room. The friends, the strangers, the soldiers, the man once invisible to all but her. For a moment, she didn't feel like a bride. She felt like a bridge between two worlds, one broken, one healing. And in that corridor of honor, lined with salutes and silences, a nation quietly bowed its head. The reception didn't begin the way most weddings did, with clinking glasses, cheerful chatter, and a dance floor waiting to be filled. Instead, it opened in reverent stillness, a hush carried from the chapel into the old community hall, where white garlands now fluttered gently along wooden beams. The soldiers entered first, not with ceremony, but with quiet purpose. Their uniforms no longer felt foreign or imposing. They were part of something larger now, a story everyone wanted to understand, a truth they were still absorbing. Maria stood by Daniel's side, hand in his, but her eyes occasionally drifted across the room to the man who had become something of a myth in a single day. Colonel Peter Marshall, formerly Old Peter, was seated at the far corner of the hall, flanked by fellow veterans. The lines on his face looked softer somehow, not erased, but lightened, as if someone had lifted a weight off his soul. He wasn't the same silent figure who had once sat outside the diner's kitchen door. Now, he listened as his brothers shared pieces of him that Maria and the entire town now had never known. He once led a recon team into enemy territory with a broken leg, one said, shaking his head with a half-laugh. Saved my entire squad with nothing but a flare and a field knife, another added. Stories spilled out like long-lost hymns, spoken not for applause but for restoration, for truth, and for honor. Maria listened, overwhelmed. Each account stitched together a man she had only seen in fragments, a man of valor, of duty, of unimaginable sacrifice. And yet, not once did he speak of himself. He simply sat, receiving their words the same way he had once received her meals, with quiet grace. The hall slowly transformed. Laughter returned. Music rose. Children danced between tables while elders wiped tears with linen napkins. Strangers approached Maria, shaking her hand, hugging her, thanking her for a kindness she never expected to be seen. Then came the reporter, a woman with a notepad, camera crew, and soft, searching eyes. "Ms. Herrera," she asked, gently, "why did you do it? Why help him all those years when no one else did?" Maria didn't hesitate. "Because," she said, looking toward the colonel. He looked like someone who needed to be remembered. The reporter's pen paused. Not rescued, not saved, just remembered. The words spread, across town, across news stations, across a country hungry for something real. Waitress honors forgotten hero. One plate a day changed a soldier's life. The kindness that rebuilt a legend. Before the week was over, Maria's name was known beyond the boundaries of her sleepy Florida town. But she never saw herself as a hero. She still brewed coffee the same way, still smiled at strangers like they mattered. Because to her, they did. Colonel Marshall stayed for a while, long enough to rebuild the bridges he'd burned in grief, to walk through town no longer as a ghost, but as a guest, a friend, a man at peace. When he finally left, it was with a handshake and a smile that reached his eyes. The silence he once lived in had been replaced, not with noise, but with meaning. Maria returned to the diner one evening, standing where it all began, the back door, the porch, the place where a gesture had turned into a miracle. And though the bench was now empty, she knew it was never really about the food. It was about being seen, and choosing to see others, even when the world looks away. Don't forget to hit that like button, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications. Share this video. Thank you.